Good evening, community. As always, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to bring you the following tale tonight. I want to remind you that if you are overly sensitive, if you are prone to getting easily influenced, take it and always treat it as mere amusement, like a horror movie, if you will. Remember that nothing can harm you if you don't believe. Remember that fear is what attracts beings that feed on it. The beings we talk about in Night Tales and similar programs. The story tonight will be quite intense. So we recommend you approach it with great caution and do not let young children listen to it. Above all, make sure no one listens alone tonight. My name is Uriel Reyes, and you are now delving into the following night tales. I had never imagined myself writing a tale for night stories, I swear. I used to listen to them religiously in those early years, when they sometimes discussed interesting facts about movies, movie horror cursed films, and those spooky stories that slowly vanished from the channel, to be honest. I preferred them. I liked the stories that I could see as fiction rather than real ones. So I started drifting away from the channel, listening more sporadically over the years until around 2018. I lost track of them because I lost my YouTube account. And it's not that I didn't believe in everything that can happen. On the contrary, in my family, before I was born, they saw terrible things with a black woman who appeared, who materialized in my house. And they say that the last time she showed up, she was getting close to my crib when I was just a few days old born. The way this woman marked my family. The horror with which they remember her has been enough for me to distance myself as much as I can from these stories, although they have always piqued my curiosity. Recently, my husband, Rafa, downloaded Spotify and gave me an account, and there you were, once again, like an old pal that I was pleased to reunite with. The distinction now being a community. I have a tale to share. It all happened in Ciudad Juarez. I am from Chihuahua's capital, but when I chose to move in with my now husband, who was my boyfriend back then, he suggested relocating to the border where he belonged, promising more opportunities to establish the business we had in mind. A friend of his had assisted in finding us several living options, and when he presented them to me, one stood out as superior to the rest. It almost seemed like a joke. There were small houses in good or improvable condition. And then there was a beautiful 2-story house with a small patio, perfect for a garden. Of course, that was my choice. I didn't even fret about the prices. As if it was shown to me, it meant it fit our renting budget. The only odd thing was that they required several months up front, which were non-refundable. You spent the entirety of the agreement on the property. I was very happy when we traveled there with our few belongings in my dad's van, with my 15-year-old dog in my arms. Upon arriving at the house in Juarez, a couple of Rafa's friends were already waiting for us. Together with him and my dad, they quickly unloaded the heaviest furniture. I vividly remember the delight I felt as we were entering that street into the private area and saw it quiet and peaceful. when I saw that the house was just like in the pictures. But I also remembered that in that first moment, upon entering it, just crossing the door, I felt as if I had been hit in the stomach. Not a strong blow, a blow like a child gives you that takes your breath away. But it was very clear. Max didn't want to enter. But I thought he wanted to play with Rafa's friends, because he loved meeting people and being petted. I had to carry him to explore the house with me. They brought everything in, placed it where it belonged, and we thought to leave the house as it was for the time being, furnishing with the little we had. My father stayed to sleep in the main bedroom that we weren't going to use because it was odd, facing the backyard, and was very dim. We stayed in the one that would be ours from then on, a small one with a street view that seemed to have been an office at some point. During the night, I noticed that Max sneaked out, scratched the door, and Rafa opened it. I know that I dreamed a lot that night. I know I had many nightmares, but oddly enough, I have never been able to recall what they were. In the morning, I heard my father crying. That's what woke me up. It was barely dawn. It was a crying that I had heard a few times, but recognized. We went downstairs to see what was happening. Max was not curled up at the door of the house, as if he had fallen asleep to never wake up again. He had died at some point during the early morning. It was one of the saddest things I have had to experience. It hurt me as if a little piece of my heart had been torn out. I had been with me since I was a child. It had been a very significant part of my life. My father, now more composed, told me that he had surely endured a little longer, just to see that new house, to be able to reach it with me. He assured me that perhaps the poor thing was already tired, but he knew he had to endure a little longer, that he had to accompany me on that journey. The strangest thing happened in the evening when we started looking for a place nearby to cremate him. When I asked Rafa if Max looked normal at most when he opened the door for him to leave the room, Rafa told me that he had not opened it, that he was sure it had been me. I told him that I had heard it, that I had woken up, but had not opened my eyes, that I thought it was him, because I heard perfectly how the door opened, how the hard handle moved, that we had promised to oil the night before. He told me he was sure it was me, that he had opened his eyes and had seen me. As I opened the door, standing next to it as if you had covered yourself with a sheet up to your neck, I would have opened it that way. But I saw you, and if it wasn't you, a woman entered the house. Even though I had tried to joke with that phrase, I told him to speak to me seriously. Please. I swore to him that I hadn't gotten up, and he changed the subject, thinking I felt guilty for letting Max out, because if not, maybe we would have heard him complaining, or maybe he would have fallen asleep between us. But something happened. Something came down. Something died at that door. I know my dog was very old, had been through a lot, was tired, but there was something strange. My dad didn't want to let me go, but I had to go back to Chihuahua. So I asked him to drive carefully. I was worried that he would leave at night, but it was a route he had taken hundreds of times, even though he hadn't done it alone in years. We heard something sad on the street. and my dad left us at home to hit the road. Baby, a man whispering. I started feeling very uneasy, very uncomfortable, and of course, I attributed it not only to being in a new place, in a new city far from my family and friends, but also because I had just lost that last tie to my childhood, my mother. Furthermore, there was something very strange, as I felt like someone was watching me from the shadows in every room, as if every place in that house, covered by darkness, was the hiding spot of something lurking. I felt my heart racing. The only thing I hoped for was my dad to call, but I didn't want to message him to check on him, so he wouldn't get distracted and something terrible would happen. When the phone rang, I answered before the first ring ended. Hello? You? I asked. Followed by a silence that might have lasted a few seconds. But to me, it felt eternal. I could only hear the distant sound on the other end of the line. A moaning. It was death. I kept talking with my dad until he arrived home. He was very scared but tried to hide it. He looked for excuses for me to stay on the line. He needed it. We hung up until Rafa entered the house. He had been listening to all the silence in the house. It was so quiet that he could hear completely. He asked me what I saw on the road, and still a bit scared by what I was about to say. As I respect him a lot, I told him I had seen death. He got up. Sat on the bed, turned on the light, told me to follow him, and turned on all the lights in the house without saying anything. Scaring me, he started searching everywhere, turning on every light in every corner. I insisted he tell me what was happening. I asked him to stop and explain. He arranged a chair close to the front door where we found Max and told me to come with him, to lie down there with him. I don't know if everything about Max has me very nervous. I heard something. But I feel like there's a presence in the house. When my friends arrived to help us unload, they told me they thought there was already someone in the house. They mentioned they saw someone peering through one of the windows, even waved at them, but received no response. I told them there was no one there, and they didn't want to say anything more. But you know, they left as soon as they could last night. And a while ago, when your dad left, I swear I saw him with someone in the back seat of the truck. And I didn't tell you because I didn't want to scare you. I wasn't going to tell him not to go. I felt like I just saw him with a ghost. I'm sorry for not telling you. Please, forgive me. I feel that if I was so strong, so adult when we went through this, it's because I saw two strong, brave men like Rafa and my dad break down like children. I heard their voices. I heard their fear. I saw it in their eyes. That's why I had to be strong, to survive. But the fear, I was also being eaten away by it. We slept very poorly that night on the street where the house was located. It seemed that no one was passing by. It was a private area. As I mentioned, there didn't seem to be any dogs. There were no noises. It seemed like no one lived there. But it was strange because all the cars were in their spots. And it wasn't because of the heat that no one was outside, something that could force people in the city not to go out, because those days the weather was quite shaky around 9 in the morning when we were cleaning with the door. We saw some children walking from the back of the private area, but just as they reached our house, they crossed the street. As soon as they passed, they crossed back and kept walking. We then began to observe closely the two houses next to us. They had closed their windows, one with wooden planks and the other seemed to have patches of drywall maybe, but all the windows facing us were permanently closed. We went towards the back part of another street, was separated from us by a wall that ran along the whole private street. But just behind us, and only behind us, on the cement wall, they had added a wooden fence that didn't allow us to see beyond. There was something very strange about our house, and the only thing that occurred to me was to go straight to the neighbors with the excuse of introducing ourselves, of saying that we would live there. I visited some houses around, however. The people greeted me from inside their door. They didn't even say welcome or anything. They answered with monosyllables, waiting for me to leave. There was a man, around 50 years old, who was washing his car. He didn't have the chance to hide when I approached, but for everything I said, he replied with a yes, yes, yes. He wasn't even listening when I told him I wanted to meet the neighbors because we expected to live there for a long time. That's when he laughed and sarcastically said, "Well, a long time." I told him I didn't know why he was reacting that way. When we had just arrived, it dawned on me that I had no intention to upset anyone. We didn't know the previous occupants of the house. Only then did he raise his gaze as if about to speak. But he held back and lowered it back to his car. However, his wife, I think, was listening from inside their home behind a metal door that didn't allow visibility inside. She called me, but she didn't that door. That barrier between us. "You really don't know anything about the people who were in that house before?" she asked me. I replied that I didn't know. She approached the door a bit, began to speak more slowly. "Look at the marks. They didn't have much time to fix it, so look at the marks. Start with the ones on your door at the entrance. Terrible things happened in that house. Horrible people lived there. But the worst of all is what happened when the house was empty." When all the entrances were sealed by the authorities. What happened in my house? Who lived there? I asked. But I only heard the neighbors breathing, and as I closed an indoor wooden door to leave me there again, alone, I quickly went to Rafa and asked him if he knew. And he said that no, they hadn't mentioned anything strange about the house. that one of his friends had gone with the agent just to check that it had everything the ad said and that it was in good condition. But we looked for the markings first. Those on the main facade. The house had undergone a complete renovation, but there were still small marks that, if you scratched a bit, you could notice had been patched up. But we were almost certain they were bullet marks. We tried to sleep, tried not to think, knowing that the next day there would be time to continue investigating. However, we weren't going to have a peaceful night. I was woken up in the early hours by the sound Max made when he wanted me to the door. For a moment, I completely forgot where I was. Forgot that Max was no longer with me. I told him to wait for me, and when I opened my eyes and got up, I immediately realized my whereabouts, realizing that Max was no longer there. "Don't get up," I heard Rafa's voice whispering. "Sleep. Close your eyes. Don't look at the door. Please. Don't turn towards the door." I didn't understand what he meant, but I discreetly lay down. I heard Rafa's breathing, heard him crying out of fear. "What's wrong? What happened? Tell me what's wrong, or I will look." I said. Rafa couldn't answer. I noticed he was trembling. The door was behind me, and I don't know how to explain that. Even though I saw how scared he was, I couldn't resist the curiosity to turn around. Perhaps curiosity is not even the right word, because there was nothing playful about it, just fear. My heart was racing. After a few minutes pretending to be asleep, I turned around. Rafa tried to stop me, but I ignored him. I turned towards the door with my eyes closed, but taking courage to them, to see what was there. At the door, what caught Rafa's attention was that when I opened my eyes, the first thing I noticed was that the door was slightly ajar. We hadn't left it like that. We had fallen asleep with so much fear that we had checked several times to make sure it was securely closed. Rafa did it, and it's because all the doors in that house were solid wood, not hollow and light like they usually are indoors in rooms. Here, all were heavy, all had very strong locks. But it was there now, and as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, when I could distinguish more details, I saw her peering in without moving, as if she were just a still figure standing right outside our room. It was the most terrifying face I have ever seen in my life. The face of a woman who seemed to have hair only on the left side of her head near the ear. A woman who was smiling toothlessly. Or at least that's what it seemed like, a smile that was barely visible. And her eyes, the worst part, were her eyes, elongated as if they were uniting. That's why she insisted so much on checking the door to make sure it was closed. He was terrified, but was trying to hide it so as not to frighten me. We spent 2 nights there, apparently fewer than the previous family who had arrived at that house. But at least we were safe, because Rafa used the place as a storage room for the rest of the lease, and when he was going to the place only during the day to drop off things. When his 2 friends, now partners, went with him, They began to gain the trust of the people around the neighbors, and there they ended up telling them the truth. The house had been the hideout of a couple of drug traffickers. They were very bad people who knew that the neighbors knew what they were doing. But they weren't worried, and the people didn't report them. Who would do it if from time to time patrols would come to greet them, exchange some comments, and then leave them?